Okay, so we're at the phase of our first fitting. This is Julia, and she's our model today, and she is showing off the size small, but we always want to make sure we do one fitting before we sew the entire thing together. So I just have one layer of the bodice sewn together right now with a basting stitch, and then we'll make a few adjustments and then go back and sew with a smaller, shorter stitch and then sew the rest of the dress together. And as you can see, I haven't sewn the bottom of the dress together either, because you don't want to do that until you've adjusted the bodice in case you need to shorten the waist or the bust a little bit. So anyways, here is the top, and as you can see, it's actually fitting quite nicely because I used a stretch fabric. Her waist is a 28 in circumference, but I used the size small, which is a 27-inch waist, because I knew I was using a stretch fabric and I wanted it to fit nice and snug. So I already had kind of accounted for that, which is why it's fitting so nicely. But as you can see, as she turns, I think with a stretch fabric, it is still a little bit more loose than I would like. So I think I'm going to take it in on the back a little bit. So I'll just pin out another 1/2 inch right here. And whenever you make adjustments, it's best to disperse the amount of ease across all of the seams. And you can always taper it out towards the, like if it's fitting nice and tight around her waist, you can always taper that down. You don't have to go 1/4 of an inch all the way down the seam. I just wanted to tighten it up top. So if we were to lay out all these pieces flat, it would have a different shape than the original pattern. It would be a little bit more tapered versus extending out towards the top. See how I just pinned these two up top? Now if there's ever any like ripples like this, you don't want that. So I'm gonna go back and with pinning, sometimes it's gonna cause that no matter what. But let's say you didn't have any pins and you were having ripples like that, then you wanna kind of reassess, like maybe unpick the seam and let it out a little bit. You don't want the fabric to ever look like it's being pulled or there's lots of tension, because it's just gonna like slowly weaken the seam and stretch out the fabric, and it's just not as flattering. So that feels a lot better. What do you think, Julia? Does that feel better?
Oh yeah. Of course.
Always ask the person you're fitting it onto as well, like how does that feel? Maybe have them sit down on a chair so that they can, especially if it's like something where it's around the waist or around the hips, if they sit down, sometimes that adds a lot more tension and you want to make sure that it's comfortable. So this is looking pretty good so far. I do think I'm going to maybe take it in on the side seams a little bit, just so that we can tighten this part up here. And this side is actually the closure for this dress. So instead of, so I'll have to like kind of adjust the way that I pin this. I'm just gonna pull it a little bit tighter so that it's 1 1/4 inches instead of just 1 inch. And then we'll straighten that line out on the sewing machine or with a ruler afterwards. So now let's see how this looks. And getting it, when I first put this on her, it took a few moments to like make sure that it was even with this horizontal line right here, because the straps are adjustable. That is going to affect, and because we don't have the skirt attached and that extra weight evening out the weight of this, we did have to like play around to make sure that these were perfectly the same length so that it was laying properly. So I'm going to have you just do another 360. Okay, so here we have the side panels, and there are 4 of these, and then we have our center, front, and center back pieces. Now, this was supposed to be cut on the fold, but just for explanation purposes, I'm not having the second half of this, because we're just gonna go over how to insert this panel into this part, because a lot of you guys have been having problems with turning this 90-degree corner, and I will admit it is pretty hard. So I'm gonna try a trick, and we'll see how it goes with this method, but regardless, it is possible to do it without doing this trick that I'm about to show you. If you gather it in and then you just maneuver the fabric and lift up your presser foot and rotate it around the needle. It's difficult, but it can be done. I've done it successfully on all of my dresses. It ends up being more of like a curve than like a perfect squared corner, so that's okay. And even if you mess up, like the gathers in itself will hide your mistakes, so don't freak out. But first we're going to add some basting stitches onto this so that we can gather it in. And then I will go over attaching it to that corner. Now keep in mind, this isn't to scale, this is way smaller, so I'm only gonna do 1 row of basting stitches, but I recommend doing 2 because it's just so much fabric, and your fabric's gonna be so heavy that your threads will probably break if you just do 1 row. So do 2 rows of basting stitches and then gather those in evenly as you watch this. Okay everybody, so now we're gonna sew the basting stitch, and we're still going to do a 1-inch seam allowance, even though this panel isn't to scale with the real pattern, just for instructional purposes. And when you sew your basting stitch, you wanna do it 3/4 of an inch from the edge and 1/2 of an inch from the edge. But since this isn't to scale again and I don't need to do 2 rows of basting stitches, I'm just gonna be doing 1 3/4 of an inch from the edge. And you always wanna back stitch at first so that when you're pulling your bobbin thread, it doesn't come out, so that you can actually gather it. So just go all the way across, and then we'll just run off, don't back stitch, trim it, and then we'll go back to the table. Okay everybody, this is optional, but it will help you. What you can do so that you can actually see what's going on is mark where your seam allowance is going to be, where you're going to pierce the fabric with your needle. Because when it's underneath the presser foot, sometimes it just gets distorted and really hard to see. So I marked my 90-degree angle right there. And I'm also gonna do that on here, on the side panel. Now I'm also gonna mark R for right side. So this is the right side of your fabric, okay? Now I'm gonna mark this side with a W for wrong side, and we're going to also mark that 1-inch seam allowance right on that corner, okay? This is very important, it's gonna help you a lot. So make sure when you do make these markings, if it is on the right side of your fabric, that it's with chalk or some other removable marking tool. Okay, since this is right side and this is right side, we're gonna put right sides together, like so. And we're gonna take the point right here of that 1-inch seam allowance crossing and match it to the point right here with the needle. And that will be the rotation point. So I want you to like tie a knot, make sure that's really strong, because eventually we'll clip this all the way to that point so that when we put this underneath the sewing machine afterwards, it's nice and maneuverable. But this is to protect it from fraying and from us cutting too far, and to kind of hold it in place so that we can get a really nice, pretty angle. And I haven't gathered this panel in yet. Okay, so right sides are together, and since that's our anchor point, we're gonna be gathering this into this shorter square right here. So I'm gonna move out that direction first. So I'm moving towards the side seam, and I'm gonna go through that marking on both layers of fabric. Okay, then we're gonna go up through the back of the side panel and up again through here, down. I'm just following that line I drew. And we're just gonna go out like maybe half a centimeter more. I know this is tedious, but for those perfectionists out there, like I know that you don't want to compromise if there's any puckers. Even though the gathers will hide them, this is a sure way you're gonna get it to look perfect. And the reason I don't want to go out too far is because we still want to gather all of this in. So it won't be gathered on that last little part, but you don't want to go out so far that there's no gathers right here. So we'll just stop right there. And I'm going to tie a knot at the back of this, and then we'll do the other side. So this is the right side of the side seam panel, and this is the right side of the center front and center back panel. So I'm just going to be flipping this under for visual purposes instead of flipping it over, because the moment I do that, this whole corner gets distorted. So this is why sewing by hand is so nice, because we can fold it right on that seam allowance and stitch it in place without confusing our minds with all the messiness that's going on right here. So I'm going to come up underneath, and then I'm going to go through that other marking, and we're going to start stitching that down in place. I'm going to come back up through the side panel, and then back down through the marking on my center front and center back piece. These stitches tight here in a second. You can see kind of where I'm going with this. Already that's pretty adequate. Like I would say that's pretty good. Look how nice that corner looks. Okay, and then once you're done just sewing down a centimeter or two, just go ahead and anchor your thread. Don't pull it too tight because then it'll pucker your fabric. So this is what it looks like on the wrong side. This is what it should look like with just those janky hand stitches. And it doesn't have to be super tight. Like I said, we'll go over it again with the machine and unpick all of this later. It's just to hold it in place, and it's a lot more flexible than like a pin. And then on the right side, this is what it should look like. We haven't gathered that panel in yet, so that's okay. We will do that. First, we want to just get this corner down while we can see everything nice and clear. So now what we're going to do is, this is the center back and center front piece, and this corner right here is what prevents us from maneuvering the fabric a lot when it's underneath the presser fit. So what we're going to do is, and we're not going to cut through the panel because there's already a lot of flexibility with this because it's all gathered up in there. We're just gonna cut through to the point right there. And just be really careful to not cut through your threads. See now, see how much easier it is to move? So now what we can do is throw it underneath the sewing machine without any major issues of puckering and whatnot. So before I throw it underneath the sewing machine, we're gonna gather this piece in by pulling those basting stitches. And you want it to match up with this side seam. And I do have notches on the pattern, but just for this purpose, I'm just gonna eyeball the gathers and kind of visually check if it's even. Okay, so now that that's gathered in, we're gonna match right sides together and pin it in place along the top, and then we'll go down. Now you do wanna keep the gathers away from the side seam because you're gonna be inserting a zipper here, and whenever you have gathers by your zipper, it's just a pain. Try and keep it nice and smooth right there. And then when we get to this point, we'll just turn. So you can squeeze in a couple gathers if you want, but it's best to kind of have the majority of the gathers before this clip mark because they'll just be hidden. So we're going to be sewing a 1-inch seam allowance. Make sure you turn your stitch length back down. Unless you want, if you're really nervous about it, base stitch it first. And I always like to look at the flat piece on top because this is the one you don't want any puckers on. And then if there's anything wrong on this side afterwards, it's a lot easier to fix. So I like to look at this side. Back stitch. So this is where our fabric turns. And then we'll rotate by lifting up the presser foot. To see how much easier that is. Just want to make sure I'm not catching anything. So right to the point, and then with your needle down, you'll lift up your presser foot and rotate your fabric. Still takes some maneuvering, but it's a lot easier to see if you're getting puckers. So make sure this piece is flat. This piece is as well. And the trick with this part is just honestly just feeling with your fingers if there's any folds or puckers. So if you just kind of go like this and like feel, you'll know if you're gonna be, you know, creasing the fabric or not. And it's just those first little stitches that are the most important. But after that, it's just a breeze. Then you just sew that straight line because there's no gathers down the sides. Okay everybody, so we did it. We turned everything right side out after putting it underneath the machine, and this is what it should look like. Now you can still see some of my hand stitches in there, so I'm just gonna go ahead and unpick those. And it always does help to do your hand stitches in a different thread color just in case, but usually you can tell just by like the shape and size that they're hand stitches. So hopefully that was helpful, but just keep in mind your gathers can go further over. I just made this really wide so that we could do that turn successfully on camera, but you can bring your gathers over farther if you want. This is what it looks like on the wrong side. So there we cut the fabric all the way to the corner, and then here's those gathers on the inside. So again, I'm just gonna unpick those hand stitches, which will clean it up nicely. Of course, you can always leave them in as well, but yeah.